The Sword of Japan by F. J. Norman. Perhaps in no other country has the sword had so much attention and honour paid it as in Japan. For, regarded as being of divine origin, it has been worshipped as such. But then, on the other hand, viewed from a European standpoint, few swordsmen in other lands have so defiled their blades as are those of Japan. For instance, it was quite a common occurrence, even so lately as the 70s, for a samurai, or gentleman soldier of old Japan, to pay a small fee to the public executioner for the privilege of being allowed to test his blade upon the carcass of a criminal, and even at times upon the living body of one. And some Japanese swordsmen, with the same object in view, went further than this, and hesitated not to resort to what they so expressively termed cross-road cutting, the victims in such a case being generally a beggar, man, woman, or child, it mattered not which to them. Among the many good sword stories told me by my old fencing master, the following is not only interesting, but thoroughly illustrative of Japanese humour, and of the weakness above mentioned with regard to the testing of sword blades. According to him, there lived in days gone by a certain great daimyo or feudal lord, who was a great patron of swordsmiths and swordsmen. One day a swordsmith in his service presented him with a beautiful blade he had just lately finished. Desirous of seeing it tested, the daimyo sent for the best swordsman among his retainers, and when he arrived ordered him to test it upon the body of a fish-hawker who happened to be passing along a road lying within the precincts of the castle. Putting the sword in his girdle, in the place of his own, which he had left behind him in the charge of a friend, the famous swordsman strutted off down the road, met and passed the fish-hawker, and returned to his feudal lord by another and shorter road. Furious with him, the daimyo asked why he had not obeyed his instructions. Begging his feudal lord to have patience, the swordsman asked him to watch the fish-hawker carefully when he came to a certain sharp turning in the road. This he did, and to his surprise saw him collapse all of a sudden, for while the upper portion of his body toppled over one way, the lower fell another. The moral attached to the tale is, of course, that not only was the sword such an exceptionally fine one, but the swordsman who wielded it so dexterous, and with so true an edge that he had made his cut, that it only required the twisting string of the fish baskets to finish his job. Up to 1876 all samurai wore two swords, that being their particular mark of distinction, and the different ways of carrying the weapon indicated the rank of the wearer. Men of high birth wore theirs with the hilt pointing straight upwards. The common people, who were only allowed to wear one sword, and then two only when on a journey, wore theirs stuck horizontally in the obi, or girdle-like sash, of the Japanese, while ordinary samurai wore theirs in a position about halfway between the other two. To clash the sheath of one sword against that belonging to another person was held to be a grave breach of etiquette. To turn the sheath in the belt as though to draw was tantamount to a challenge, while to lay one's weapon on the floor of a room and to kick the guard with the foot in the direction of anyone else was a deadly insult that generally resulted in a combat to the death. It was not even thought polite to draw a sword from its sheath without begging the permission of any other person present. A Japanese gentleman of the old school calling on another, even though he might be the most intimate friend, invariably left his sword with the doorkeeper of the house. So little did such men, apparently, trust each other. As I believe that I was the first Occidental to make a study of Japanese swordsmanship, it may be of interest if I here describe my experiences in the fencing schools of Tokyo. And so to begin. The summer of 1889 found me established in Tokyo, and as the sedentary nature of my duties commenced to tell on my health, I decided to take up the study of kenjutsu, or Japanese fencing. Getting into touch with the authorities at the Kajiko, or head police station of Tokyo, I soon secured an introduction to the Imazawa-san, the fencing master of the Takanawa police station, and then quite one of the best swordsmen in Japan. Never did a maitre d'armes take more interest and pride in a pupil than Umezawa did in me, and this was all the more commendable on his part because the majority of the fencing masters in Tokyo looked upon his teaching me Japanese swordsmanship as a renegade act. The first dozen lessons or so were given me on the little lawn in front of my house, but after a while I used to attend daily at the Takanawa police fencing room, and for a couple of months or so fenced with, or rather took instructions from, the best fencers attending there. When he thought I was sufficiently advanced, Umezawa set me to fence with some of the more indifferent and harder-hitting swordsmen, but was always close at hand to give instructions and correct faults. Writing as an old cavalryman with plenty of experience of regimental drill grounds and gymnasiums, I can safely say that the Japanese system of teaching fencing is far and away superior to that in vogue in the British Army. And for rough, dismounted work, the Japanese system of two-handed swordsmanship is much superior to any of the systems of Europe. A first-class French or Italian duellist would, more than probably, beat a first-class Japanese swordsman, but only so if fighting on ground thoroughly suitable to his own peculiar style of swordplay. On rough ground, on a hillside, or on a ground covered with impedimenta, the Japanese swordsman would more than likely have the advantage. Or, in other words, in positions where a rough-and-tumble fight is going on, and where men want to kill and kill quickly without attending too much to details of form over it. As a weapon of offence and defence, a katana is an infinitely superior one to the absurd 36 inches bladed single-handed sword with which the British infantry officers are armed, and with slight modifications in its make and use it could be rendered still more effective. In the first place, its blade is considerably shorter, from 10 to 15 inches, thus allowing for the majority of men greater freedom of movement, for nobody can deny that to a dismounted man a long scabbard is a horrible nuisance, and that to a shortishly inclined man it is an absolute encumbrance. But though shorter in the blade, the katana has a longer grip, and when one has learned to use it aright it is truly wonderful what little length of reach is lost. This great length of grip permits the use of both hands for the purpose of delivering a crushing blow or cut, and moreover, after practising the Japanese style of fencing, a swordsman becomes quite ambidextrous. How very disconcerting this last is to an opponent all swordsmen are fully aware, and when to this is added the fact that the katana play is a closer play than that of the cut-and-thrust sword of the Occident, it must be admitted that it is an infinitely superior one to it for the one and great purpose of a fight to the death. It is certainly not so taking to the eye as, let us say, a French or Italian swordsman's play, but while there is less ostentatious art and ceremony about it, there certainly is just as much science, and it may also be added as much, if not more, deadly intent. Among the many swordsmen who used it to put in their daily attendance at the Takanawa fencing room was one who very early attracted my attention. He was an elderly man, and in some respects a finer swordsman than Umezawa, who introduced him to me one day as his sensei or teacher. Onoda was his name, and though he was exceedingly tall for a Japanese, he was quite the best built one I have ever come across. For a long time I could gather nothing more about him than that he did not like foreigners, and that it would be just as well if I did not thrust my acquaintanceship upon him. Later on I learned he was, or had been, the hereditary fencing master to the late Shogun, or Generalissimo of Japan. All this, of course, helped to arouse my curiosity, but a grimmer or more forbidding old man never lived than Onada-sensei. And so what was my surprise when some 6 months after I had begun learning Kenjutsu, he came up to me one afternoon, and presenting his card, offered to take me on for a bout. Delighted at the thought, I was soon ready, but no sooner did the other fencers in the room see what was going to happen than they stopped fencing, and making quite a ring around us, stood looking on with what I could not help but thinking were quite troubled faces. They knew well that Onada-san had highly disapproved of my being admitted to the fencing room, and I am not sure but that some of them did not think my days were about to be numbered. They were quite wrong, and Onada-san and myself got on so well after this, that instead of keeping aloof from me any longer, he rather sought than otherwise my company. In his way he was a most peculiar old fellow, a sort of Buddhist Puritan, and when he found out that I had spent some years in India, he was for ever asking me questions about it, its people, and their religions, etc. He did a thing one day I never knew another Japanese man to do, and that was to reprove a fellow countryman for his being rude to me and calling out after me in the streets. Being an old samurai with an exceptionally fine presence and manner, he did this in a way that sent the erring individual literally grovelling in the dust of the road. With such a man as my friend and instructor, I was soon more than able to hold my own with the average good swordsman of Tokyo, and remarkably useful I found the being able to do so, for it brought me into contact with a class of Japanese few, if any other foreigners, have ever had the chance of becoming acquainted with. However, to revert to the Kenjutsu. The kabuto, or helmet, though it is undoubtedly superior as a fencer's mask to that used by the sabre players of Europe, yet on the other hand it has certain defects about it. For while giving ample protection to the face, neck and throat, it does not sufficiently protect the sides of the head, nor yet its top or crown. It sits firmer, however, than do any of our fencing helmets or masks, being tied or rather lashed onto the head. Under it is invariably worn a tenagu, or a small native towel wrapped around the head in a turban-like fashion. The reason for this is of a purely cleanly or sanitary nature, and the result is that no Japanese helmets ever had an unpleasant odour. The do, or corselet, is a lighter, cooler, and every way a far superior chest and body protector to the leather jerkins of European sabre players. It is made of slips of the very best and soundest of bamboos, strung perpendicularly together in the required shape, and trimmed and strengthened with fastenings of leather, silk, or hemp. The best do are lacquered with the mon or crest of the owner, and remarkably handsome some of them are. They are worn hanging somewhat loosely, being suspended from the shoulders by soft cords of cotton or silk, but never so loosely as to prove a nuisance to the swordsman. Kusadzuri, or tesis, is a light and efficient enough protector for the lower parts of the body, but hardly as good as those in use in British gymnasiums. They are generally made of a tough cotton or hempen canvas, cut in 5 strips of about 9 inches in length and 4 in width, 2 strips lying under and 3 outside, and each strip is well quilted. Though hanging loose, the strips are fastened to a band that encircles the waist of the fencer, but in such a way that does not impede his movements in the slightest degree. The koti, or gauntlet, is a hand, wrist, and forearm guard much superior to anything to be seen in our gymnasiums. The koti is made of strong cotton or hempen canvas lined with the bamboo shavings, or horsehair, and trimmed and strengthened with a soft kid-like leather. One great advantage the Japanese koti has over our gauntlets is that its size can be regulated up to quite an appreciable degree by the loosening or tightening of the lacing running along it and inside its forearm portion. The shinai, or practice sword, is made from 4 strips of bamboo, and though it undoubtedly looks clumsy enough at first, it is not so by any means. The length and weight of the shinai vary according to the taste of fencers, there being no rules laid down about this. Surely a fairer method than ours, which forces all men to use the same size practice sword, irrespective of their stature and strength. The 4 strips of bamboo, being cut to fit each other, are then brought together, and over the grip or handle end of the shinai is drawn a long leather covering. The grip may be of any length, say from 8 to 14 inches. From the guard end of this covering runs a leather or gut strand to the point of the shinai, and is there fastened to a leather cup-like covering that keeps together the ends of the 4 bamboos and forms a button over their points. The line along which the gut runs is considered the back of the sword, and the shinai is strengthened and kept together by a fastening of leather at its cutting point. Advantage is taken of this to run the gut through it, and so help to keep it all the tauter in its place. The tsuba, or guard, is a circular piece of stout leather with a hole in the centre to permit of its being passed up and over the grip until it reaches the hilt, where it forms a circular guard standing out from the shinai an inch or a little more. Sometimes, but not often, a fencer will use a secondary tsuba made of thin leather and padded like a cushion. This will lie between his hand and the ordinary tsuba. The measurements of my favourite shinai are blade 26 inches and grip 11 inches. But it must be pointed out here that I stand but a trifle over 5 foot 6 inches, and have somewhat small hands. The hakama, or divided skirt of the samurai, is a most comfortable article of clothing, which, while it affords a certain amount of protection to the legs and lower parts of the body, does not in the least impede a fencer's movements. It is light, airy, and cool, and might, with very great advantage, be introduced into England. Japanese fencing rooms are all built on more or less the same plan, and the Takanawa fencing room was no exception to this. It was about 30 foot in length, and about half that in width. 2 of its sides were open to the air, and along its other 2 sides ran a raised platform, a couple of feet or so above the floor of the fencing arena. The platform was furnished with mats, and on cold days with fireboxes, and was used indiscriminately as galleries for spectators or dressing and resting rooms for the fencers. Such men as like to keep their fencing gear there could do so, hanging the same up on pegs along the side of the gallery. Here it must be pointed out that all Japanese fencers have their own special kit, the fencing room supplying nothing. 2 men agreeing to have a bout will, after donning their kit, step into the arena, and squatting down in front of each other at about 6 feet apart, will then proceed to salute one another by a bow. Rising slowly, they will put themselves into position with a shinai, crossing at engage. To go into details over all the cuts, guards, and points of a Japanese fencer's repertoire is not the object of this article, but it is well to point out here that during a 15 years experience of kenjutsu, I remember only seeing one man make use of a backhanded stroke, and he was one of the best swordsmen in Japan. Another remarkable point about the Japanese system of swordsmanship is that its native votaries never deliver a point except at the throat, but this is, perhaps, explainable by the fact that until the 70s, armour was largely used by them. This point even is more of a job than a lunging thrust, and is delivered from below upwards, with the very evident object of getting it in between the gorget and the upper part of the breastplate. Though highly scientific, kenjutsu is a very rough-and-tumble sort of swordplay, absolutely free from parade and all theatrical touches, but wonderfully practical withal. As Japanese chivalry is most uncompromisingly based upon the idea that all is fair in war, so Japanese swordsmen resort to certain methods which are highly reprehensible from our point of view. Such a thing as giving another man a chance never appears to enter their heads, and so, should a fencer lose his shinai or fail in any way, his adversary immediately takes advantage of this to push home his attack with a greater vigour. The cuts most in favour with Japanese swordsmen are mainly of the chopping order, and mostly delivered at the head and right wrist. Some few, however, pay considerable attention to their adversary's stomach. If skilful swordsmen, these are the most difficult to tackle. The cuts at the head and wrist can be delivered from the engaged position, and in the case of the former this is done by slightly raising the shinai, stepping sharply forwards, and as sharply bringing the shinai down upon the adversary's head with a chop that carries on. The wrist cut is made by a disengaging cutover with, if necessary, a sharp side tap against the adversary's shinai to throw it out of line. Both these cuts can be parried by a slight raising of the shinai and an outward twist of the wrist, and from both parries return cuts can be made at either head or wrist. Ordinarily, Japanese fencers stand much closer to each other than do those of Europe, and it is truly remarkable what little space a couple of good native swordsmen require for a fight to the death. Some, on the contrary, are very fond of keeping well away, and if not followed up and brought to close quarters, resort to a totally different mode of attack, consisting mainly of slashing cuts, first with one hand and then with the other, the changes being carried out with wonderful rapidity. The principal swinging cut can be delivered for either side of an opponent's head, but if he is a good swordsman it is somewhat risky one to resort to, for he can reply to it by either a stop thrust or a stop cut at the head. The guard for it is a mere raising of the sword to a sufficient height and in the right line. There is only one form of hanging guard known to Japanese swordsmen, and it is seldom resorted to, for it makes a smart return a matter of great difficulty. A good swordsman is held in high repute among the Japanese, but curiously enough a good swordsmith is perhaps more so, and the names of such men as Amakuni, Kamigi, Shinsoku, and Amaza of the very olden days, and Munechika, Yasutsuna, Senemori, Yukihira, and Yoshimutsu of the Middle Ages are known to all educated subjects of the Mikado. And then, as for Masamune, Yoshihiro, and Marasama, their names are household words in every homestead of the land. The two best swordsmen I have met in Japan were Shakikabara and Hemni. The first was a tall, rather slightly built man, but though a grand swordsman, somewhat inclined to play to the gallery. Henmi-san, on the other hand, was a most unobtrusive individual, standing about 5'1" and quite the most graceful man that I have ever seen. But though Sakakibara had a great following amongst the general public of Tokyo, there is little doubt Henmi was the better swordsman of the two. I have seen him, while fencing with a first-class swordsman, stop all of a sudden, drop his shinai, and then invite the other man to attack him. But try as this other might, he could seldom get a cut into him, for where Henmi was, the fraction of a second before, the spot would be vacant. The Japanese have always been very fond of giving names to their swords, such names being usually derived from some circumstance connected with their career. The grass-mowing sword, for instance, was so called because when a brushwood fire threatened to destroy his army, Yamato Taki mowed down the intervening brushwood with it, and so stopped the flames and saved his troops. The Higakiri and Hizamuru were two famous swords belonging to the Minamoto family, and owe their names to the fact that when they were tested on a couple of criminals sentenced to decapitation, one cut through the beard of the victim, after severing his head from the body, while the second cut through the hiza or knee of the other luckless wretch as he sat or squatted to receive his death blow.